Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update. I am your host, Richard D. Wolfe. Today, we are going to talk about something that the mainstream press loves to discuss in terms of strategy or military hardware or geopolitical chess. But we are going to look at it through the lens that actually explains what is going on. The lens of economics, the lens of decline, and the desperate flailing of a system, specifically the United States military-industrial complex, that can no longer deliver on its promises. We have a fascinating situation developing to our north in Canada, and it involves the United States. It involves the F-35 fighter jet program, the most expensive weapon system in the history of the human race, and it involves a former and perhaps future President Donald Trump. It is a perfect storm that reveals the cracks in the American empire. Let's look at the facts. We have reports now, documents surfacing, indicating a massive shift in Canadian defense policy. We are talking about a strategy that involves over 500 billion Canadian dollars invested over the next 10 years. But here is the kicker. Here is the detail that should make your ears perk up. The Canadian government is looking to shift 70% of that defense procurement to Canadian companies. Now, why does this matter? Why is an economist talking to you about fighter jets? Because for the last 70 years, the relationship between the United States and its allies, Canada, Europe, Japan, has been defined by a very specific economic arrangement. The United States provides the security largely by forcing these countries to buy American-made weapons, integrating their militaries into U.S. command structures like NORAD or NATO, and in exchange, these countries get access to the American market. It is a protection racket. Let's call it what it is. You buy our planes, you use our software, you rely on our maintenance crews, and you stay within our sphere of influence. But what happens when the product you are being forced to buy is broken? What happens when the protection becomes too expensive? We are seeing exactly that with the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. For years, the Canadian government has been wrestled into this program. They were told, you have no choice. The F-35 is the future. It is the only plane that can talk to American planes. If you want to defend the Arctic against the Russians, you need this plane. And now we see Donald Trump in his typical chaotic fashion slashing the F-35 program, questioning its costs, questioning its utility. And simultaneously, we see Canada looking at the bill, the maintenance costs, the engine failures, the sheer technical incompetence of a project that is years late and billions over budget. And they are saying, wait a minute, there is a leaked claim, a very important piece of information suggesting that the supposed advantage of the F-35 over its competitors, specifically the Swedish-made Saab Gripen, was inflated. It was exaggerated. It was marketing hype designed to secure a monopoly for Lockheed Martin. Think about that. The Canadian people were told they had to spend billions on this American jet because it was superior. Now, it turns out that superiority might just be an accounting trick, a sales pitch. This brings us to the core Marxist critique of this situation. Capitalism, in its monopoly stage, does not produce the best product. It produces the most profitable product for the monopolist. Lockheed Martin does not care if the F-35 is the best plane for defending the Canadian Arctic. They care that they have a captive market. They care that once Canada buys the plane, they are locked into a 40-year contract for parts, for software updates, for sustainment. It is the ultimate rent-seeking behavior. But the Canadians are waking up. This new strategy, shifting 70% of procurement to domestic companies, is a direct response to the unreliability of the United States. They are looking at the America First rhetoric. They are looking at the tariffs. They are looking at the threats to dissolve alliances, and they are making a rational calculation. They are saying, we cannot rely on the U.S. supply chain anymore. It is too volatile. It is too political. So they are considering the Saab Gripen. Now, the Gripen is an interesting contrast. It is cheaper. It is easier to maintain. You can fix it on a roadside with a small crew of conscripts. It is designed for defense, not for projecting imperial power across the globe. The F-35 is a Ferrari that spends half its time in the shop. The Gripen is a reliable truck. And this terrified the U.S. establishment. Why? Not because they care about Canada's safety, but because if Canada walks away from the F-35, it breaks the chain of leverage. If Canada builds its own defense industry, if it buys Swedish planes, it is no longer structurally dependent on the United States military industrial complex. It regains a measure of sovereignty. This is what we mean when we talk about contradictions. The U.S. pushes America first, demanding allies pay more. But by being so aggressive, by being so unreliable, the U.S. forces its allies to develop their own industries, which ultimately hurts U.S. corporations. Trump screams about the trade deficit, but his policies force Canada to stop buying American jets, which increases the trade deficit. It is a serpent eating its own tail. Let's go deeper into this inflated advantage. The documents suggest that the criteria used to judge these planes were manipulated. They were rigged to favor the F-35's stealth and interoperability, buzzwords that mean integration with the U.S. war machine. They ignored metrics like availability, cost per flight hour, and sovereign control. If you buy an F-35, you don't really own it. The software is controlled in the United States. If the U.S. government decides they don't like what you are doing, they can essentially turn off your Air Force. That is not defense. That is submission. The Gripen offered technology transfer. It offered Canada the right to build the planes in Canada, to own the software, to control the destiny of their own defense. So when we see this CAD 500 billion plan, this move to Canadianize defense, we are seeing a rupture in the neoliberal order. For decades, we were told that globalization meant we should just buy whatever is cheapest or best from the global market. Countries shouldn't have national industrial policies. That was inefficient. Well, clearly that era is over. We are returning to a world of economic nationalism. And while I am no fan of military spending, imagine what $500 billion could do for Canadian healthcare, for housing, for education. We have to analyze the move on its own terms. It is a rejection of U.S. hegemony. The irony is palpable. The U.S. spent decades destroying its own manufacturing base, outsourcing everything to chase cheap labor while maintaining a bloated military sector as its last industrial stronghold. Now, even that stronghold is failing because it has become too corrupt, too expensive, and too technically complex to function. And the vassals, the Canadas of the world, are looking at the emperor, realizing he has no clothes, or at least that his clothes are incredibly overpriced and don't fit. This F-35 program is a microcosm of the U.S. economy. It is financialized. It is all about the stock price of Lockheed Martin, not the performance of the product. It is about lobbying, not engineering. And when you try to export that dysfunction to your neighbors, eventually they recoil. Canada's pivot to the Gripen, if it happens, and the pressure from Washington to stop it will be immense, would be a historic signpost. It would signal that the U.S. can no longer simply demand obedience. It has to earn it. And right now, technologically, economically, and politically, the United States is not earning anything but mistrust. This shock of Trump cutting the program is not the cause, it is the catalyst. The structural problems were already there. The engine issues were there. The cost overruns were there. Trump just said the quiet part out loud. This plane is a disaster. And if the President of the United States says the plane is a disaster, why on earth should the Prime Minister of Canada buy 88 of them? Welcome back. In the first part of our discussion, we established the framework. The F-35 is not just a plane, it is a mechanism of economic control. It is a tether that binds the Canadian economy and military to the whims of Washington and the profit margins of Lockheed Martin. Now, I want to dig deeper. I want to look at the specific contradictions that are tearing this alliance apart and why this story, Canada acts as U.S. security leverage, is a signal flare for the end of the American century. Let's talk about this concept of interoperability. You hear this word thrown around by generals and pundits on CNN. They say Canada must buy the F-35 because of interoperability with NATO and NORAD. It sounds technical, it sounds benign, it sounds like making sure your iPhone charger works in your friend's house. But in the world of global military capitalism, interoperability is a euphemism for subservience. With the F-35, interoperability means that the logistical brain of the aircraft, the software system formerly known as ALIS, now Odin, reports back to the United States. It means that a technician in Cold Lake, Alberta, cannot fix a circuit board without permission from a server in Fort Worth, Texas. It means that if the United States government decides to withhold a software update because of a trade dispute or because they don't like Canada's foreign policy on dairy or lumber, the Canadian Air Force is grounded. That is not an alliance. That is a landlord-tenant relationship. And Canada is realizing that the rent is too damn high. This is where the Saab Gripen enters the picture as a fascinating economic alternative. We have reports fueled by leaks and strategic analysis that the so-called advantage of the F-35 was inflated. Of course it was inflated. Every monopoly inflates the value of its product. That is marketing 101. But the specific inflation here was regarding stealth. The Americans sold the F-35 on the premise that you need to be invisible to fight a war with China or Russia on their doorsteps. But Canada's primary defense need is patrolling the Arctic. It is defensive sovereignty. You don't need a stealth bomber to intercept a Russian Tupolev bomber over the Beaufort Sea. You need a plane that works. You need a plane that starts when it is 40 degrees below zero. You need a plane that can take off from a highway because your airbase has been bombed or iced over. The Gripen was designed by Sweden, a neutral country with a small population and a massive, aggressive neighbor, the Soviet Union, now Russia. It was designed exactly for the conditions Canada faces. It costs roughly $20,000 to $25,000 per hour to fly. The F-35, depending on who you ask and how they cook the books, it is $40,000 to $50,000 an hour. Over the life cycle of a fleet, that is a difference of billions of dollars. For a Marxist, this choice is illustrative. The F-35 represents the imperial model, expensive, offensive, integrated into a global hegemony designed to project power outward. The Gripen represents a sovereign defense model, cheaper, defensive, locally maintainable, designed to protect borders. By leaning toward the Gripen, or even just threatening to, Canada is signaling a shift away from being a junior partner in U.S. imperialism and toward being a sovereign nation protecting its own territory. And that terrifies the Pentagon because their entire global strategy relies on allies footing the bill for American power projection, the Arctic scramble, and the $500 billion question. Now look at the new Canadian strategy document. They are talking about investing over 500 billion Canadian dollars over 10 years. That is a staggering sum, and they want 70% of that procurement to go to Canadian firms. This is a direct rejection of the neoliberal free trade dogma that the U.S. has pushed for 40 years. The U.S. has always said, open your markets, let our superior corporations compete. But now that the U.S. is becoming protectionist under Trump, America first, Canada is responding with Canada first. If Canada spends $500 billion inside Canada, that creates a multiplier effect. It builds a domestic industrial base. It creates high-wage union jobs in Quebec and Ontario. It develops intellectual property that stays in Canada. If they send that money to Lockheed Martin, it vanishes. It becomes stock buybacks on Wall Street. It becomes executive bonuses in Maryland. The Canadian bourgeoisie, the domestic capitalists, are looking at this and saying, why should we export our capital to the U.S. when the U.S. is threatening us with tariffs on steel and aluminum? It is a rational, albeit nationalistic, response to the breakdown of the global order. But we must also look at why this money is being spent. It is the Arctic. Climate change, a product of unchecked capitalist industrial expansion, is melting the ice. The Northwest Passage is opening up. Suddenly, there are shipping lanes. Suddenly, there are vast reserves of oil and gas that were previously unreachable. And where there is profit, there is conflict. The U.S., Russia, China, and Canada are all eyeing the Arctic like vultures circling a carcass. The militarization of the North is not about security in the abstract. It is about securing the rights to exploit the last untouched resources on the planet. Canada knows it cannot rely on the U.S. to protect Canadian interests in the Arctic. In fact, the U.S. disputes Canada's claim that the Northwest Passage is internal Canadian water. The U.S. says it is an international strait. So, ironically, Canada is buying weapons to defend its sovereignty not just against Russia, but potentially against U.S. encroachment on its resource claims. Buying the F-35 to defend against the U.S. dispute over the Arctic is like buying a burglar alarm from the burglar. It makes no sense. The Gripen, with its technology transfer and lack of kill switch software, offers true independence. The collapse of the offset scam. There is another layer to this economic onion. The industrial and technological benefits, ITB policy, often called offsets. Usually, when a country buys U.S. weapons, the U.S. company promises to invest an equal amount back into that country. Lockheed Martin promised billions in contracts to Canadian firms if they bought the F-35. But under the F-35 program's specific rules, the MOU, guaranteed offsets were banned. Instead, Canadian companies were allowed to compete for contracts. They were told, if you are good enough, you will get work. Well, guess what happened? As the U.S. becomes more protectionist, those contracts are being pulled back to the U.S. Trump explicitly wants supply chains in America, so Canada is paying billions for the plane, but the promise of industrial work is evaporating. The leveraged advantage is gone. The Gripen deal offers 100% guaranteed offsets. Saab is saying, we will build a factory in Canada. We will give you the blueprints. You can build the plane. For a nation fearing the economic volatility of the U.S., the choice is obvious. One path leads to dependency and job losses. The other leads to industrial capacity and autonomy. Trump as the catalyst of decline. We must address the elephant in the room, Donald Trump. Liberal commentators view Trump as an aberration, a mistake. Marxists view him as a symptom. He is the expression of a U.S. empire that is overextended, crumbling internally and lashing out. When Trump slashes the F-35 program or threatens NATO, he is inadvertently accelerating the end of U.S. hegemony. He is forcing allies to do what they should have done decades ago: diversify. By being an unreliable partner, the U.S. is losing its security leverage. Leverage only works if the other party believes you will protect them. If they think you might abandon them because of a tweet or a bad poll number, the leverage vanishes. Canada axing the U.S. leverage is not an act of hostility. It is an act of survival. If the U.S. economy is heading into a crisis, which it is, and if the U.S. political system is paralyzed by polarization, which it is, then Canada cannot tether its lifeboat to the Titanic. Conclusion: the socialist perspective. So, where does this leave us, the working class? We are watching two capitalist powers, a declining imperial hegemon, the U.S., and a resource-rich middle power, Canada, squabble over which military-industrial complex gets to profit from the next generation of war machines. While I analyze the rationality of Canada choosing the Gripen or domestic production, we must never lose sight of the tragedy of this entire debate. We are talking about $500 billion. Do you know what $500 billion could do? It could end homelessness in Canada forever. It could fully fund a transition to green energy, making the fight over Arctic oil irrelevant. It could provide free university education for every Canadian for a generation. It could rebuild the crumbling healthcare system that Canadians are so proud of. Instead, this wealth, created by the labor of Canadian workers, is being funneled into machines of death. Whether those machines are built by Saab or Lockheed Martin is a secondary question to the primary crime, the squandering of human potential on preparation for war. But we live in the world we have, not the world we want, yet. And in this world, the unraveling of the F-35 deal is a significant crack in the armor of American empire. It shows that the U.S. can no longer command obedience. It shows that the profit-seeking of U.S. monopolies has become so predatory that even their closest allies are recoiling. The inflated advantage of the F-35 is a metaphor for the U.S. economy itself, overpriced, under-delivering, relying on past reputation, and fundamentally fragile. As Canada moves to axe this leverage, we should applaud the weakening of U.S. imperialism, because a weaker empire is a less dangerous empire. But we must also organize. We must demand that these billions be spent on life, not death. We must demand a defense policy that is truly defensive, not a subsidiary of the Pentagon's global crusades. The F-35 may be a stealth fighter, but it can no longer hide the reality of a system in decline. The leverage is gone. The emperor is naked, and the bill is finally coming due. Thank you for joining me. I'm Richard Wolff. And remember, democracy shouldn't just be something we do once every 4 years in a voting booth. It should be something we practice every single day in our workplaces and in our economy. That is how we build a future worth defending.